Hey everyone, for any of you who don't know me, my name is Sydney and I'm the GA for this class. During this lecture, I'm going to be discussing Chapter 4 on energy metabolism. To start off, energy balance represents the relationship between energy in and energy out. Both weight gain and loss are influenced by not only the type, but also the amount of energy intake and output. When energy intake is less than energy expenditure, we will see a weight loss, and when energy intake is higher than energy expenditure, we will see a weight gain. Total energy expenditure represents the energy out portion of the energy balance equation and is made up of basal metabolic rate, adaptive thermogenesis, and activity energy expenditure. Basal metabolic rate is resting energy expenditure, so it's the periods of times throughout the day when an individual is not participating in any type of physical activity or exercise, but they are still awake. Activity energy expenditure, on the other hand, is those times when an individual is participating in some type of physical activity or exercise. Carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids make up the energy intake portion of the energy balance equation. And as we can see on this chart below, each type of nutrient contributes a different energy value to the energy balance. So carbs and protein each contribute 4 kcal per gram, and fats contribute 9 kcal per gram. And overall, 1 kilocalorie is equal to 1,000 calories. Both the quantity and the composition of ingested nutrients influence the balance of energy within the body. So as dietitians, it's important that we look at not only the amount of food that an individual is eating, but also the type of food that they are consistently consuming in their diet. So that ingested food is transferred into ATP within the body, and it produces heat and meets the needs of the body. There are 2 main types of metabolism that work within the body. We have aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic requires oxygen and it occurs within the mitochondria of cells, and anaerobic does not require oxygen and it occurs within the cytoplasm or the fluid-filled portions of the cells. Carbohydrates play a big role in the metabolism of energy. One of these ways is through the oxidation of lipids or fats, and another is through the process of glycolysis, which is a metabolic process in which in which glucose is fully broken down into ATP. Right here in these figures, we can see on the left is the chemical structure of glucose, and on the right is a depiction of the process of glycolysis and the steps that that glucose molecule will go through in order to turn into ATP. The citric acid cycle is an aerobic metabolic process in which carbs, protein, and fat are fully broken down in order to produce ATP. So remember that aerobic means it does require oxygen. So in order for the citric acid cycle to function properly, oxygen will have to be present within the cells. The electron transport chain is a series of reactions in which hydrogen atoms are transferred by NADH and FADH2 in order to generate energy to be synthesized into ATP. This is where oxidative phosphorylation comes in, and it picks up the energy that was produced by the electron transport chain and it synthesizes it to make ATP. Lipids are another nutrient that play a big role in the metabolism of energy. Triglycerides are the primary fat found within the diet, and they are also the main form in which fat is stored within the body. Triglyceride is made up of 1 glycerol molecule to every 3 fatty acid molecules. And glycerol is a carbohydrate-like substance that goes through the process of glycolysis like a glucose molecule would. And this just shows the relationship between some of those nutrients and how they go about metabolism in the body. Protein is the 3rd component that makes up the energy in portion of the energy balance equation. Both the both an adequate intake of protein as well as physical activity are both necessary in order to build muscle within the body. In the average adult, about 25% of energy stored within the body is made up of protein. This is found in things such as muscle fibers, blood components, hormones, enzymes, as well as some parts of cell structures. Although protein can be stored as energy in the body, energy metabolism should never be the primary function of proteins. So in order to determine which nutrients are being used for fuel, we can look to the respiratory quotient, which is a factor that will indicate which portion of carbs, fat, and protein are being used to produce energy. Each nutrient is going to have a different and distinct respiratory quotient. And right here we can see the different caloric values of oxygen, and as we can see, they vary depending on the primary type of fuel being used. Protein and carbs also play a role in the oxidation of nutrients. These are both thermic nutrients, which means they generate heat within the body. They're readily oxidized in proportion to their intake. So that means that the oxidation of these nutrients is about level with the intake, meaning that excessive amounts are not typically stored within the body. And the intake and oxygen of both of these is tightly regulated within the body. It is possible to have an excess storage of carbohydrates as fat within the body. However, this is typically unlikely because it is suggested that upwards of 2,500 kcal strictly from carbohydrates would need to be consumed in order for the body to start converting that into fat. So for most individuals, it is unlikely that this would happen. Fat is another factor that influences the oxidation of nutrients. In individuals who are on a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, we do see a promotion in obesity. This is due to the fact that high-fat diets stimulate hunger, which will increase the amount of nutrients an individual is taking in, so there's typically an excessive amount of energy intake. And also, the decreased amount of carbohydrates slows the oxidation. So without enough carbs, all of the fat is not being oxidized, and some of it is being stored in the body. Also, the different types of fat are going to be oxidized differently as well as react differently within the body. So individuals who expend more energy in exercise and physical activity typically oxidize more fat. This is due to two facts. First being that fat stores are much larger than glycogen stores, and they can be called on to support to support increased energy needs for a considerable time. And second is that the adipocytes, which are the fat cells, are sensitive to catecholamines, which are the hormones released when people exercise. Both low intensity activities as well as exercise training have both been shown to increase the oxidation of fat. Also, differences in muscle mass will affect the oxidation of nutrients. Individuals who are overweight and obese tend to have fewer fast twitch muscle fibers, as well as a lower production of epinephrine, which is the hormone that allows for the release of fat from the adipose tissue. And so weight gain then will occur because there is a lower rate of oxidation, which means some of the fat is being stored in excess within the body. Muscle lipoprotein lipase is another variable that differs depending on an individual's body mass. So in terms of metabolic rate, we have basal metabolic rate as well as resting metabolic rate. Both of these can kind of be used interchangeably. They essentially measure the same thing. However, basal metabolic rate focuses more on conditions of low cellular activity, whereas resting metabolic rate is measured at any time during the day. So it's typically more practical for determining energy expenditure. We can use one of two methods to calculate RMR. One is direct calorimetry and the second is indirect calorimetry. Both of these are used to measure the amount of heat that is generated by metabolism. Direct calorimetry is an actual measurement, and it uses a room calorimeter, which is a small chamber that will actually measure the amount of heat being produced. Indirect calorimetry, on the other hand, is an estimate that we get by using mathematical equations as well as looking at things like the respiratory quotient. Indirect calorimetry is not as precise as direct because it is an estimate, it's not actually measuring anything. However, it is typically more practical because it does not cost anything and it's more accessible to individuals. This right here is a chart of some different equations that can be used to calculate RMR. However, with this class, we will typically use the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. So body size accounts for 80% of the metabolic rate in an individual, and 60% of this comes strictly from the brain, liver, heart, and kidneys. There are other factors that will affect metabolic rate as well, including thyroid hormone production all the way to age and race. And we're going to look at some of these in more detail throughout the next few slides. So body size alone is the most important determinant of metabolic rate. And it does have the ability to raise an individual's RMR if they are larger. This makes sense because if we look back, body size accounts for the majority of metabolic rate, and also in the equations we use to calculate RMR, we always depend on weight to get the end result. So in individuals who experience complications with their thyroid hormone and the production of thyroid, individuals who typically have complications with their thyroid hormone either suffer from hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism causes an individual to have an increased appetite as well as an accelerated metabolic rate, which will in turn cause them to lose weight. Hypothyroidism, on the other hand, reduces an individual's resting metabolic rate, and they oftentimes have a decreased level of physical activity, which will cause them to gain weight. So hyperthyroidism is related to weight loss, and hypothyroidism is related to weight gain. Nutritional status is another big component that can affect an individual's resting metabolic rate. Individuals who are undernourished tend to have a decreased RMR. This is due to loss of weight or muscle tissue, as well as the fact that when the body is in these periods of malnourishment, most of the energy that is stored in the body is being conserved by the brain. In these individuals, any type of exercise will not counteract the effects of having an inadequate intake of nutrients. In individuals who overeat, we see an increased RMR even if that is not accompanied with a weight gain. 25 to 50% of resting metabolic rate is due to genetic factors, and gender, age, and race can also play a part in the resting metabolic rate of an individual. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is the increased oxygen consumption for a period of time after physical activity. It is also referred to as oxygen debt or recovery oxygen. And the reason for this increased consumption of oxygen is due to the fact that the body has an increased temperature as well as an increase in cardiorespiratory functions. And there's also an additional energy need in order to return the body to its pre-exercise conditions. Overweight and obese individuals have higher RMRs, like we previously talked about. A good portion of this is due to the fact that they do have a higher weight. However, some things such as heredity and repeated dieting can also play a role in the end result of their RMR. And repeated dieting is it's like yo-yo dieting, where an individual will be on a diet for a period of time, they'll get off of it, they'll either get back on that one or another diet, they'll get off again, and this causes the body to, this messes up the metabolic rate because the body is never in a consistent state in terms of nutrient intake. And this can explain some of the reasons why some individuals experience difficulty with losing weight as well as managing their weight. Okay, so right here I have included an example of how to calculate resting metabolic rate using the Mifflin-St. Jean equation. You guys have already had some practice with this on your last case study series 2 quiz. However, I did notice that some of you seem to be a little confused maybe on how to calculate it, so I included this for your reference if you need it. And if you feel like you need more practice with this, you can complete application 4.1, which is on, I believe, page 111 in your book. And this just asks you to calculate your own RMR. As I said earlier, table 4-4 does include some different formulas that you can use to calculate RMR. However, we typically will be using Mifflin-St. Jean. So if you need a reference, I have included it here. On to the second type of energy output that makes up our total energy expenditure is adaptive thermogenesis. This is the production of heat in the body that follows exposure to cold or the intake of food. About 15% of our daily energy expenditure is made up of adaptive thermogenesis, and diet-induced thermogenesis is a component of adaptive thermogenesis in which heat is produced by body cells, particularly brown adipose tissue, and this is strictly in response to eating. Brown adipose tissue is a type of fat tissue. It is present in humans as well as some animals who live in cold environments such as hibernating bears, and its role in the body is to maintain body temperature. So when an individual consumes food, there are two components of diet-induced thermogenesis that contribute to an increase in energy expenditure. One of these is obligatory thermogenesis, which is the involvement of increased energy expenditure immediately after eating, as well as for a period of several hours afterwards, in order to support the ingestion, digestion, absorption, and transport of foods. Facultative thermogenesis is the heat that is produced in brown adipose tissue. The number of calories consumed, the type of nutrients, as well as some specific foods such as caffeine, which are known to increase the metabolic rate, are all factors that can affect the diet-induced thermogenesis. So weight gain is not just a function of caloric intake. Diet-induced thermogenesis may explain some variability in individuals' ability to gain weight. So we have seen in some obese individuals that there is an issue with the way that thermogenesis works in their body, and this is causing them to have a weight gain. So here are some factors that can affect adaptive thermogenesis, like we previously talked about: cold exposure, as well as the amount and types of food that an individual consumes, as well as the quantity and the thermic activity of the brown adipose tissue. And if any of you want more practice with diet-induced thermogenesis, you can complete application 4.2 in your textbook. On to the third and final component of energy out, we have activity energy expenditure, which is energy expended in all activities that occupy our time when we are not at the basal level of energy expenditure. This is the most variable component of energy out. It does include non-resting activities that are both non-resting as well as not a type of physical activity or exercise. And the effectiveness of the activities depends on an individual's body size as well as the type and volume of activity that they are completing. In order to measure activity energy expenditure, we have two main methods that we can use. We can calculate the respiratory quotient to get an estimate of caloric expenditure. We can also look at heart rate monitoring, which is a more reliable method because it actually shows the amount of oxygen being consumed relative to an individual's expenditure of energy. Energy expended can balance or unbalance the energy balance equation. Activity energy expenditure has the greatest capacity to raise daily energy expenditure, and it can be both exercise or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So non-exercise activity thermogenesis are things like walking around the grocery store, or if you get up to go make a coffee at work. It's not, your body's not in a state of rest as with BMR, but you are not performing some type of exercise. This right here is a physical activity index, and it just shows the relationship between total energy expenditure and resting metabolic rate. And then again, these are some more factors that can affect activity energy expenditure, individual factors like we talked about earlier, as well as some aspects of an individual's physical environment. So things like, do they have access to a gym? Can they walk around their neighborhood? Do they have some way that they can participate in physical activity, things like that, as well as their social environment. So do they have support from family and friends? They have encouragement to participate in this physical activity. So kind of sum things up, as we have seen, variations in individuals makes it difficult to set a standard for caloric intake. You know, it's really, we can't really even split it up based on age ranges or gender, age, things like that, because even within some of those larger groupings, there are still so many variations between individuals that impact the amount of calories that they need. So this is why it's important for each individual to calculate their caloric intake as well as their expenditure in order to establish a realistic target for caloric intake for them based on their individual lifestyle. Okay, that is all I have for you guys for Chapter 4. Ms. Kingston is going to be doing Chapter 5, which is the other chapter in this unit. In the meantime, if any of you have any questions or concerns about any of the topics discussed or any of the activities within this unit, feel free to contact either one of us. I hope all of you have a good day. Thank you for watching.